Hi and welcome. So today we're going to recap some of the things we talked about very briefly in the first class, and that is, okay, what is qualitative research? Why do we find ourselves going into the field? What are we looking for when we're there? And how do we know when we found it? And sometimes what happens when we find something very different. So all kinds of campaigns and messages and advertising are influenced by qualitative research. I mean, this Department of Health campaign on pouring on the pounds, even though I think it's a really awful message and visual, was focus group tested. And when former Mayor Bloomberg decided that he was going to work to pass the soda ban, there was a lot of surveying done and even focus groups and interviews with people. And the surveys essentially said that there were more than a third of the folks who thought it was a good idea. But what really you got to see once that effort rolled out was how strongly people felt against the soda ban. So are surveys better than sort of like talking to people and studying people qualitatively? Well, not actually. So what we're going to talk about is social research. That's what qualitative research is. And there are a number of very powerful things it does. It sheds light on why human beings act the way they do. We get a chance to not just tap into their moment's opinion about something, but to really explore their attitudes, their desires, what they value, what they're willing to do or not willing to do in terms of changing a behavior. Qualitative research, social research, often informs the design of all kinds of programs and communications campaigns, and you can use qualitative research on an ongoing basis to evaluate programs. I'm just going to leave this slide up for your review later, but there are these very reflexive, reiterative ways that we get to question ourselves, get to question people, construct meanings around what this might signify. And we do that because the things that we're observing, we try to see with very new eyes. So we don't bring a lot of assumptions and hypotheses to a situation or event. We keep an open mind, and we try to see it almost as if it's a strange thing. And it can be as simple as, watching patients in a waiting room, or watching people watch President Trump speak, but seeing it with new eyes. So most of the time, we're doing action research in social settings, in real life settings, or trying to replicate those settings as much as possible. We're focusing a lot on language and behavior. Often we're very collaborative with our participants. We don't call them subjects. That's something that's done in quantitative work. And we're getting close to trying to understand people's knowledge and attitudes, especially, say, in my field of health, how these were shaped, how fixed or fluid or flexible are these attitudes and perceptions. Essentially, trying to see the difference between the perception of things and the reality of things. And the question that the social researcher is always asking themselves, particularly in qualitative research, is, okay, I see this event before me, or this behavior, or this, this discourse. What is this that I'm seeing? So as a qualitative researcher, you want to be aware of how you're seeing things. Here's Here's an example I always keep in mind, just on how language presents what we're seeing. The English speaker says, "I make the horse run." The Navajo speaker says, "The horse is running for me." And so in this simple surface level language difference is a world of differences about how the English speaker perceives the world and who dominates over the animal kingdom, and how the Navajo speaker sees the world. So if you look at these smoking advertisements that I'm about to show you, you can basically ask the same thing. What is this before me? What does it represent that doctors back in the 1920s and 30s were recommending certain brands of cigarettes because they were less irritating? Or that in the 70s and 80s, cowboys and ruggedness was associated with cigarettes. And then we fast forward to the 90s and we said, well, what could this mean? Why are these smokers out on the ledges? As smoking bans began to be put into place all around the country, if not the world. And fast forwarding to these very years that we are in now, where smoking is equated to these horrifying illnesses and the degradation of the human body. So, how do we know what people think about issues? Safety, health, politics? We ask. And I know that sounds a lot easier than it actually is, and we'll spend a lot of time over the next few weeks learning how to ask. But the basic tools, the methods we use are ethnographic observation, interviewing people everywhere from formal to informal, focus groups, oral histories, and very small scale, if you will, surveys. But the skills that we try to constantly develop as qualitative researchers, and I'm still working at it these decades later, is how do we construct questions that are very human-centered, that don't sound like a test? How do we constantly work to put aside our preconceptions and to analyze fairly and justly? And then what do we do with our analysis and our interpretation? So interviewing is something we'll spend a lot of time with, and you'll be watching a lot of videos on this. You will be designing ways to observe situations, designing protocols. How am I going to observe this encounter between the mother and the child? What kind of contact sheets am I going to use? Will I draw a map of what I see? How else will I record what I'm observing? How do I form open-ended questions? How do I analyze them? What does an interview really sound like when I have certain goals in mind? And again, what about groups? What about working with groups, particularly focus groups? Look at why focus groups are so very versatile and useful. And perhaps even case histories. When do case histories really help us shed light on people's personal narratives? So, as I mentioned before, just a few of the projects I've done in the last few years. I might be bringing in some of these examples in for us to look at data-wise was the Children's Museum project, where we had cameras mounted all over the ceilings, and we had observers on the floor a couple of days in a row, where we could actually see kids interacting with the installations and try to understand what they thought it was all about, what they liked, what they were having fun with. Did they learn anything about the topics that were eating healthy, exercising, and sleeping well? We might bring in a project that I finished for the government, which was looking at people's attitudes towards using their mobile devices to communicate with their doctor, access their personal health information, What were the concerns particularly about privacy? So to sum it up, why do we go into the field? We go into the field to really describe and analyze patterns that we see between people and their environments. Irving Goffman has a wonderful term that I keep in mind a lot. We often go into the field, and if we're lucky, we come back with a precious little thing, an insight, something someone says, and he calls those intimacy trophies. Very often, we go into the field and we come back with even more questions than we started with. And the cycle begins again. So, this is just an introduction, and we'll be taking it quite a ways from here.